Well, good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I'm glad we're all together today, and gladder still that Shabbat is here and a chance to step back a little bit from all the business of life. And this is a very interesting point in the Jewish calendar, because tomorrow, excuse me, tomorrow we observe a lesser known event in the Jewish calendar called Pesach Sheni, a second Passover. And I'm going to start this morning by bringing up on the screen the section from the Torah where this comes into play. We can all see that. We're in the book of Numbers, chapter 9. And as we see often in the Torah, laws and statutes evolve throughout the story when people from the children of Israel come to Moses and Aaron and pose a question. So God, in a sense, provides the commandments, but in the narrative of the Torah, the commandments continue to be delivered, not just on Mount Sinai per se. The 10 were given. Remember, there are 613 in total. And some of those are really derived based on questions asked by the people themselves. And this is a really excellent example of that. And so in this section of Numbers, chapter 9, we'll start at verse 4, and Moses spoke to the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And there are many, many, many reiterations of the laws related to the festivals, related to Shabbat, which we're going to look at in the second part of today's Torah study. And Moses says, and they shall keep the Passover in the first month. Interesting, the month of Passover is called the first month. It's the Hebrew month of Nisan. That's a Babylonian word, most likely meaning like the month of springtime. It's also in the Bible called the month of Aviv, literally the month of springtime. And so in this first month, on the 14th day of the month at dusk in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so did the children of Israel. So there's the basic reminder to keep Passover. And then here's what happens. But there were certain men who were unclean by the dead body of a man, so that they could not keep Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And remember that in ancient times, there was a lot of some superstition and some justified, some unjustified fear about being in contact with the dead. And they, as we know, there were all kinds of involved rituals to help those who were defiled by the dead to become purified, like the red heifer as an example, the ritual of the red heifer. And so the state of purity of a person was in many ways a preoccupation in that ancient world, just like they were preoccupied with the purity of the animals they would sacrifice. We read that phrase, without blemish, over and over again in the Torah regarding a sacrifice. And so here we have members of the community who have become unclean by a dead body, and so they could not keep Pesach on that day, because on that day they were separated from the camp and they were in a state of defilement. So those men said unto Moses, we are unclean by the dead body of a man, wherefore are we to be kept back, so as not to bring the offering of the Lord in its appointed season among the children of Israel. So they're saying, hey, we want to fulfill this commandment of Passover. And for them, it was giving a sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice. But they're saying we're defiled. We're not allowed to do it. Can you do something about that? And Moses said unto them, and this little phrase here occurs many times in the Torah, stay right there. Basically says, stand right here, and that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. So imagine, the situation is they've come to talk to Moses in what was known as the tent of meeting, and they asked their question, and the writers are suggesting, and Moses just sort of gave ear to God, looking for an answer. And lo and behold, what happens? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or of your generations shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey far away, yet he shall keep the Passover unto the Lord. How? In the second month, and that's the month following the first, of course. In the Hebrew calendar, it's ER, and we're in ER now. In the second month, on the 14th day at dusk, literally 1 month later, they shall keep it, meaning Passover, and they shall eat the Passover offering with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And so they invented this Pesach Sheni to those people unable to observe because they were defiled, unclean, or captive, or out of town, if you will. And I wondered, and this is the question I want to pose to you. What do you think is the message in this, in this whole idea of creating a second Pesach, Pesach Sheni? What do you think? What message can we discover in this lesser known fact of Jewish tradition? What do you think?
Like it was a way to keep people in the fold instead of excluding them.
Very good. Yes.
Maybe it was for a deeper meaning with the second one. You could even explore it more deeply. No?
Well, it's really interesting. That's an interesting point. If we read further on in that section of the Torah, it does say that people who did it on the right date are not allowed to do it on the second date too.
Huh. No do-overs.
No do-overs if you did it right at the right time. You get a second chance if you couldn't do it at the right time, which is interesting. So I don't know if there's deeper meaning in the second version of Pesach. But I think you're suggesting something really important about what's in the minds of those people who missed it the first time. And that I think it's showing their added measure of devotion, because those people could have just blown it off, right? They missed it. It's all right. I blow it off. Do it next time. But instead, they step forward and say, we don't want to be left out. So there's an extra measure of intention, of depth, maybe, perhaps, certainly of desire, commitment. And in that sense, I think you're right that there's something deeper going on for those individuals with Pesach Sheni than necessarily everyone else who did it at the right time and they followed instructions and, you know, they maintain their commitment. But here's this group comes along and says, but what about us? They had to make extra effort. And God seems to reward that, right? They made the extra effort, so God says, of course, of course.
Did they have to observe the week of not eating leaven?
No,
So it was just the sacrificial lamb
just the sacrificial offering with with unleavened bread
bread.
and maror
Okay, and maror, right?
and
The
bitter
3 days.
herbs. Yes, as we read. So it's not the full bone Chag Hamatzot, Festival of Unleavened Bread, of course, which is 7 days. It begins on the 15th of Nisan and goes for 7 days, the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Remember, we've talked about 2 holidays being
2
observed
holidays, right? So it was just
simultaneously.
that one holiday.
So this is just regarding the Pesach sacrifice.
Mhm.
Interesting.
And
What other messages you think we use the word Leerosh Uncover, to uncover. What other messages could we uncover in this?
Forgiveness. I mean, just that there's a sense of forgiveness towards people, you know.
Very good. There is this sense of if people are stigmatized or they're sick, they may be separated from the community, but not ostracized from the community. And that's why I've always pointed out, we read the sections in, this is from Numbers, but if we go back to Leviticus and we read those sections in Leviticus about all the different forms of defilement, you know, everything you can imagine, prohibited relationships, the whole bit, all the gory details of Leviticus, that bar and bat mitzvah parents dread that their children should have to read those sections at their bar and bat mitzvahs, because it's filled with all that gory stuff, you know. And yet, if particularly on the topic of leprosy, which is a temporary condition, hopefully, in other ancient tribal settings, people who developed these kind of chronic, contagious illnesses, you know, they were cut from the herd, so to speak. It was typical practice to be cut from the herd. The Israelites were so unique in this regard. They were separated in quarantine from the community, protected by the community, fed and nourished by the community. And I always say it represents one of the greatest examples of a public health policy, conceptualized by our ancestors. And that's remarkable in and of itself. But there are a number of examples like that where the Israelites were extremely, not in a political sense, but conceptually progressive in their attitudes about common standards of that ancient time period. Another example of that, just like the leper can return, ultimately, hopefully return to the community. It was Israelite tradition that created the idea of protective custody. And why did they create protective custody? So, and again, in Leviticus, it talks about a manslayer. And it's not clear whether it's an accident or whether it's premeditated. And they created what were called cities of refuge. And a manslayer, where it was still not clear, remember, in a world of lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, you kill some of my family, I can go immediately and take, from you what you took from me. And even though we have lex talionis, that principle of equal measure for equal measure, also typical in Jewish tradition, we have exceptions to that sort of what seems like an overarching imposing principle. And yet, even with lex talionis, they created cities of refuge where a person who had killed somebody could go and be protected from retribution, from revenge
Wow.
on the other family. And then it would be determined. They would go to the gate of the city and judges would sit and they would listen and they would determine, is this an accidental death? Was this intentional? They looked at the circumstances. And I've always said it's one of, from an Israelite perspective, it not only what we saw them really introducing was what we now just banty around the term due process. Due
Interesting.
process. So when we talk about Pesach Sheni, there is something forgiving about it or protective about it. You're right about that, Sherry. I want to give you another example of this notion of second opportunities if they've been missed. And this is a piece of Jewish tradition people often don't hear. So, we have Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year. God bless you. I heard someone sneeze. Sei gesund. I heard a sneeze. We have Rosh Hashanah, beginning the 10 days of repentance. And the first 9 days are about resolving issues with other humans that we have to do ourselves. And then Yom Kippur, the 10th day, turns to our focus to our relationship with God. And when we get to the end of Yom Kippur, we've been there, I'm sure. And we're like, and the Ne'ilah service at the very end. I've made some jokes over this over the years, but it's like we're all standing there pleading, open the gates, open the gates, open the gates, let our prayers in, let our prayers in. The gates are closing, the gates are closing. And there is a lot of drama around that, fear and trembling, and this notion that we've got to get the teshuvah completed and done before the gates close on Yom Kippur so we can be written in the book of life, right? Well, guess what? Even with the drama associated with these kind of ultimate preoccupations of life and death at the end of Yom Kippur, what did Jewish tradition do? But they don't publicize it very much. The gates don't actually close on Yom Kippur according to Jewish tradition. They don't really close at all. In fact, there are a number of traditions that say the gates, the two different traditions. One tradition says the gates of repentance never fully close. And that's why we have a mini Yom Kippur with every Rosh Chodesh, every new Jewish month. There's a little mini Yom Kippur with every new month in Judaism. So every 28 and a quarter days, the gates crack open a little bit again. 12 times a year, the gates crack open and they never really close completely. So Teshuvah is not just 10 days, it's all year. But then there's something else really interesting, a holiday that is not very well understood called Shmini Atzeret. So, we have Rosh Hashanah, we have Yom Kippur, and then we start Sukkot, the festival of booths, and that's about taking account. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is about taking what we call a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of our souls. And then we go to Sukkot, and that's supposed to be a time when we take account of our physical bounty, of our harvest, of our gathering, of what we have in a very physical sense. And at the end of Sukkot, the last day of Sukkot technically is called Hoshana Rabbah, when prayers for rain commence. And in ancient times, you'd have the priests take willow branches on Hoshana Rabbah, and willow was associated with water. And they would walk around the ancient temple, beating the ground with their willow branches as a way of kind of like beating water into the ground. And that would be the end of Sukkot. The next day, Shmini Atzeret, is considered a holiday unto itself. It's technically not Sukkot. It's the day before Simchat Torah, technically. And that Shmini Atzeret, it's interesting, the word Shmini means 8, the number 8, and Atzeret means stop. So like if you go in Israel, Atzeret, here's the word, you can hear it. You go in Israel and you get on a bus, on an Egged bus, and you want to get off the bus and you remember the cord you can pull, tell the driver, let me off. Well, when you pull the cord on a bus in Israel, at least it used to be this way, I haven't been in a few years, but there's a big red sign up at the front of the bus with the word Atzur, from like Atzeret, stop. And this big red Atzur light comes on. So something about that 8th day stop, like 8th day boundary, 8th day demarcation of some kind. And the rabbis interpret it and say, well, actually, although we didn't want to make a big deal of it, because we really want you to do it between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the gates of repentance actually stay open until Shmini Atzeret. And that's when they actually close. So it's almost again saying, if you missed it at Ne'ilah and you missed it on Yom Kippur, there's a second chance for you. All the way, you can keep repenting and asking God, let me in the book of life, etc., all the way to Shmini Atzeret. And as if that wasn't good enough, then they said, man, but if you didn't get it done by Shmini Atzeret, you can do it at the next Rosh Chodesh for the next month. And if you didn't get it that month, guess what? In 28 and a quarter days, you'll get a chance again. And then again, and then again, and then again. And I think if you combine this example with Pesach Sheni, you start to get a feeling for what this is really about. And it's really about Judaism's common sense about how humans operate. And that even though there's this layer of formal drama, formalism, etc., and pomp, circumstance, ritual, all that, underneath it is an idea that I call radical compassion. That there's this radical compassion at the heart of all of it. That it's not about exclusion. It's not about marginalization. It's not about saying now or never. It's saying, keep trying. And as long as you keep trying, the tradition is going to try to support that. You're trying. And the thing, it goes right back to the section of the Torah we just looked at, that it said just a group, it's like a group, some people came forward. We don't even know their names. Some people came forward and said, well, what about us? We really want to do this, but we couldn't. And God responds, says, no problem. Here's an alternative. Right? Now I'm going to retell a story because I love to tell it. I'll tell it to anyone who will ever listen. But you know, that what we read about in this Pesach Sheni lesson, you know, talks about God's equanimity in a sense. Whereas if you look across the landscape of the world and the history of the world, people who go to war over religion don't subscribe to the notion of God's equanimity.
Mhm.
They clearly don't, right? And the story, the story is, remember, God has a house and with a whole bunch of people living there. And, God says, in the morning, there's a yellow card, wake up, go to school. At night, there's a blue card, go to sleep, wash up. And then you got a whole group of people in that house saying, but we're colorblind. Now, the God I believe in is the God who allows Pesach Sheni. It's the God who allows Shmini Atzeret. It's the God who has Yom Kippur 12 times a year. Is the God that would say to the colorblind children, no problem, I have something for you too. Whereas the truth of the matter is, there are just too many people in the world, in our very, for the most part, unenlightened, unsophisticated world, that say, well, if God doesn't want colorblind, that's fine with me, not my problem.
Can I ask a question?
No questions allowed.
So, I mean, going back to, some of your discussions from months ago, where you talked about sort of the advent of the transit, whatever, the Christian beliefs, and all that. So how did this belief, get changed? I mean, like, this concept of God is not one of punishing, cutting off people. How did that change after Christ came around for people who followed that route?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, because, in the Jewish concept of God, the way you're talking about it, there's not this concept of inherent sin, that
well,
we're bad and that we need to get punished or cut off.
so here's what I want to ask you to do, is to hold that question. And the reason I want you to hold the question is the second part of what I want to share today actually contradicts completely what we just talked about. And
Okay.
it's also in the Torah.
Okay.
So on the one hand, there's this message of God's equanimity and always looking to allow opportunities for people to strive for holiness. And if you miss it here, you can do it here. And this, notion of many chances, many opportunities. But today's Torah portion, interestingly enough, in confluence with tomorrow is Pesach Sheni. Today's Torah portion presents something completely contrary to this. So let me present that, and then let's ask your question. Okay? Because what we're going to find out is that the way God is portrayed is not consistent in the Torah, as we might expect. And there are all kinds of reasons, different writers, different portrayals, different circumstances, different portrayals, different time period of writing, different portrayals. And so there are contradictions. So what's new? We're Jewish. Contradictions. That's all we're all about, contradictions. And so I want to talk about now this week's Torah portion. It's Amore, and it's from Leviticus, starting in Leviticus 21. And I'm going to just give you a quick summary of it. In this section, 63 commandments are related out of 613. So that's a pretty considerable number in one sidra, one weekly reading. And virtually all of them, 90% of them focus on sanctifying time. Reiterates all the laws of Shabbat, all the laws of the festivals, and the notion of sacred times. And then in the middle of it, we find something really interesting. In the middle of all these laws about time and time-based observances, we find this sort of interruption and this singular assertion of a very different mitzvah. And it's a mitzvah, you've heard of it. It's called Peah. It's the law of leaving the corners of your field for the poor. So in the midst of this whole scheme of sacred times, all of a sudden in the middle of this, there's just this little tiny section. And by the way, while you're doing all these sacred times, don't forget about the law of the corner of your field for the poor. And I think, one of the things we can draw from that is that Judaism is not just about the ethereal sacred times. Judaism is also about life on the ground, literally on the ground. And the Peyah mitzvah is the epitome of a commandment about sacred space. And what is more sacred space in an agricultural community than the field? And so they're saying it's good for you to observe all these things, the time-based commandments, keep the festivals, keep Shabbat, but don't let that blind you to life on the ground. While you're looking up at heaven with all these time-bound commandments, don't forget about Torah on the ground. It's like Torah up here, and then there's Torah on the ground. And Torah on the ground is the sacred field, the sacred space, and take care of the poor. And so the Torah then goes on and is really trying to talk about what do we mean, what makes something holy? So what makes for a holy time? Let me ask you that. What makes for a holy time? What do Jews mean by holy?
Separate.
Set apart.
Yeah.
Purposely set apart for a specific purpose. Not just set apart for the sake of setting apart, but setting apart for a purpose. So you leave the corners of your field for a purpose. And you set that area apart. And the holy purpose is to feed the poor. Mm-hmm. So sacred times, we do these holidays. And what makes them sacred? Well, we light candles, we have special prayers. We're not supposed to work during those sacred times in our regular work. It's like a Shabbat. We're supposed to take time off and pray and study, and according to Jewish tradition. And then the Torah portion does something very strange. After all that, it ends up, and we read about, I think, one of the most disturbing, shocking, unpleasant sections of the entire Torah, in which God says, if you are blind, if you are a dwarf, if you are physically disabled, if you are imperfect, you cannot participate in a whole range of rituals that are set aside just for people who aren't broken. But people who are broken, sorry, you can't participate. And I'm sad to say that there are some places, fewer and fewer, I'm glad to say, but there's still some places in the ultra-Orthodox world where if you're blind or disabled, you can't come up to the Torah to say a bracha. And so now, starting to move toward your question, Sherry, on the one hand, we just read in the Torah about God's forbearance, really. And on the other hand, now we're reading in the Torah that God doesn't seem to be forbearing at all when it comes to imperfection. So I want to respond to this problem in the Torah. And one of the ways I want to respond to it is I read about a child that asked the following question. Children usually have the best of them all. Child asked, if nobody is perfect, and we are all created in the image of God, then God must not be perfect either. So you hear the logic of that, and it's actually impeccably true, logically. If nobody is perfect, and we're all created in the image of God, then God must not be perfect either. So in some ways, what we end up sort of describing here is this kind of a theological tension. And the theological tension is, on the one hand, a portrayal of a very loving, flexible, tolerant deity, on the one hand, and yet another concept of holiness that is built on strictness, where God is in a much more authoritarian role rather than an intimate kind of interpersonal role. And I'm be honest with you, I don't think the purpose is for us to solve that. But I think we can be, I think what we can do and we should do is be honest about it. When I say be honest about it, I mean, I think it's perfectly okay for us as thinking Jews to read that section about marginalization, rejection, stigma, the stigma attached to these people with disabilities in the Torah. I think it's perfectly good for us to call it out and to see it for what it is, probably generated from a male-dominated, privileged, institutional, exclusionary social idea. Doesn't that sound familiar? So that notion, you know, and I know there's a lot of discussion about, you know, European triumphalism and all these sort of Western ideas that have led to, you know, societal, institutional racism. My point is, sadly, it's been going on from time immemorial, and it's right here in our Torah too. And things have not changed very much, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that our ancestors, and whether they did this consciously, unconsciously, intentionally, or accidentally, the fact that our scriptures portrays both of these portrayals of God is pretty progressive in and of itself. And even though we have this in the Torah, this exclusionary, you know, offensive rejection of people, we also read in the Torah at the same time, do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Again, contradiction. Blind can't participate, but don't put a stumbling block before the blind. So I'm going to put this out there, and I think it's partly related to your question, Sherry, is what meaning are we supposed to derive from that? The blind are excluded from certain ritual practices because they're blemished. And at the same time, it says in the Torah, do not put a stumbling block before the blind. What do we do with that? What do y'all think?
So who's perfect? Who's supposed to go up and read from the Torah? Nobody's perfect.
Of course. But there is this tradition that if you are a disabled person, based on this week's Torah portion, there are limits set on what you can and can't do ritualistically.
I think the problem is if you focus on just one part of the Torah,
Exactly.
one parsha, one couple of verses versus the contradictions you find in other portions, other parshas and other verses. I think that's where you make the mistake. I think you have to accept the Torah as a whole and understand that there are complexities and contradictions galore, but it's for me at least, it's an imperfect document because of that. And I have to take from it what helps me be a better person and not worry so much about the other parts.
Beautifully said, Charles.
I mean, last week's Torah portion, I think, included the part about not being gay, that being prohibited. So would you also understand that as part of the strict authoritarian male-dominated notion of things rather than the accepting of human nature as it is?
Well, I approach this question in terms of in a more philosophical sense. And that's to say that separate and apart from the faith relationship one has with this text, we have to look at it also as a piece of literature. And as a piece of literature, it comes from a time and place.
Yeah.
And in that time and place, you know, a lot of mythic writing or ancient historical writing, it may sound funny to talk about it in this term, is created through the filter of the science of the time. And when I say science, people's rational attempts to understand an unfathomable universe. And there's, you know, mythic ways of explaining an unfathomable universe. And then there's every age has its sort of scientific lens that is a snapshot in time of whatever truth, factually speaking, logically speaking, in terms of, you know, people have been doing science from time immemorial, and it's become more and more sophisticated. But, you know, in a world that really, really only could conceptualize the world was flat, so many social ideas were filtered through that basic scientific premise. And then all of a sudden one day, that wasn't true anymore. So people had to now revisit their social assumptions that grew out of their scientific assumptions that were limited by their time and their context. And so I think when you read the Torah as a historical document, we know there is some real history in that document. We know there's prose in that document. We know there's mythic fantasy in that document. But it is connected to a time and place. And in that time and place, a lot of the practices that are prohibited in ancient Israelite culture are things they observed that other tribes allowed. And a good deal of what ends up being in the negative commandments, remember we have positive commandments, thou shalt, and we have negative commandments, thou shalt not. And there's certainly a number of those negative commandments that are based on the authorities of that time frame, the people conducting leadership in that society, primitive as it was. And they look over there and they see the Amorites and they're like, we are not like them, therefore don't do what they do. And we have really sections of the Torah that are those kinds of expressions. They're assertions in a sense of negative identity. We are not like them. Israelites are different. And I think some of these male hierarchical, male dominant, hierarchical, institutional, racist, misogynistic, we can look at all the stuff that derives right out of the Torah itself. And we can say they are a product of a time and a place. But as our science expands, as human intellect grows, as we have an age of enlightenment, God knows we need another age of enlightenment, because it feels like the world's going backwards these days. It really does. It really does. But it won't be the first time the world has progressed and gone back and progressed and gone back. And that just may be part of the human story of human civilization, till either we destroy ourselves or someone else from out there comes and says, hey, you don't have to do that anymore. I can accept those parts of the Torah that are offensive to me, and I'm not justifying them at all, but I see them for what they are and where they came from. And then I see other parts of the Torah that have these glimmers of brilliant spiritual insight. And I think, as Charles was suggesting, maybe there is a blessing in disguise, in a sense, that the Torah provides us all kinds of positive examples, but it also gives us negative examples to learn from. And sometimes the negative examples are also very important. One of the things about Christianity, now to Sherry's question, see, you thought I might have forgot, but I didn't. To Sherry's question, is one of the things that really distinguishes Judaism and Christianity is that when we talk about God, look at what we talk about. We talk about contradictions. We talk about the God on high and the immanent God. We talk about the God that forgives and the God that condemns. We talk about a multifaceted God with a personality of many dimensions. One of the things that's really noticeable if you sit down and you read the New Testament is that, and a lot of the mythical context of Christianity, particularly in its origin and in the original formation of the Catholic Church, and you look at the Nicene Creed, which is the first original statement of Catholicism, there's a tremendous amount of effort to portray Jesus as the unblemished sacrifice, the unblemished God, like a physical embodiment of perfection and a spiritual embodiment of perfection. But then I go back to what the child asked, if nobody really is perfect and we're all in God's image, then God must not be perfect either. Christianity has a very hard time tolerating that idea. And so you look at how Jesus is portrayed, think about it for a second. Immaculate conception. I mean, he's conceived without anything sexual, because carnal is bad. Virgin birth. Comes into the world and I just have to say it explicitly, comes into the world and apparently doesn't come from a vagina. It's like, what does that mean, virgin birth? But it's, again, purity because of associations with impurity, right? A genius child, at the age of 7. And just this unblemished idea of the Christ character, of what began as a concept of the Jewish Savior which was never intended to be a perfection. I mean, the idea of the Messiah, remember this, Mashiach in Judaism is the anointed king of the people, human king, like King David. Was David perfect? Oh my gosh, he was so imperfect, so imperfect. And if you look at all the major characters of Jewish tradition who were, pivotal in the unfolding of the story of our people, they're all, I think, very consciously portrayed as very imperfect. From Abraham on down, they are all like character studies in imperfection. And then you have in Christianity the Jesus character, where there's this, really a very interesting merging, because when you talk about the Messiah no longer as the king of the Jews, and you start talking about a cosmic Messiah, a cosmic Christ. Well, if we're talking in cosmic terms, now we have to talk about perfection. Because Jesus is called the final sacrifice, the Lamb of God, all this notion, Yom Kippur becomes obsolete. The giving of sacrifices becomes obsolete because Jesus is that final paschal sacrifice. And like all sacrifices, for them to be accepted, they have to be perfect. And so you see the construction of a very different worldview in which a single event in history completely, and that would be with the birth of Jesus, Jesus's death and resurrection, that with that package of events, the passion of Christ, the package of events, all of world history, all of human nature is transformed. And that's very different than Judaism's view of sacred history. Our view of sacred history is that God revealed God's self and then said, here's what I want you to do to create a sacred world. Puts the onus on humanity and the responsibility on humanity, and on the Jewish people, hopefully, to maybe lead and set an example in humanity about what it means to create sacred spaces and sacred times. That's not Christianity's approach. Christianity's approach is we have these events that represent a vortex in the unfolding of history, and all it takes is faith in the truth of these events and in the cosmic Christ who died for you. Then everything is transformed. And it fascinates me. I once had an interfaith dialogue with an Episcopal priest. And I used to say to him, how is it that you get like 400 people to services every Sunday morning, every day of the year? And he said, because we have a very neatly packaged story to tell. And people come and they want to hear it every week because it's comforting. And it doesn't require very much.
Wow.
And I said, well, what does that mean? Like Jews do you know that Jews have never been big time synagogue goers? Never in history. It's always been a remnant of a synagogue that shows up in a synagogue. And so I used to say, well, why can't we get Jews to go to synagogue every Shabbat? And part of the answer I came up with is that we have a complicated package. It's simple, sort of, but it's also complicated. We sort of thrive on the contradictions. We thrive on the idea of a burning bush, a bush that burns but is not consumed. Completely illogical. So Jews are asked to come and wrestle with the illogical, whereas Christians are asked to come and hear a bedtime story. Sorry, this sounds pejorative, but hear a beautiful bedtime story. And for Christians who choose that, this is what I end up said to my Episcopal priest friend. I said, you know, I could never, I'm not going to be a Christian. I couldn't be a Christian, but I guess I have a little envy. Because what Christianity did is took God, full of contradictions and full of multifaceted, mysterious things that we can't explain. And Christianity took that and packaged it in one human being walking on the planet. And in that sense, God, through Jesus Christ, is like, I think the true Christian believer is like immediately accessible. Immediately accessible. And, you know, and then Christians add to the drama and say, and then God sacrificed God's only son. You say, well, why? It's like, if the guy was walking on earth and he was the perfect example of holiness and the embodiment of the divine, why wouldn't you just let him live forever? Why wouldn't you just let him walk around forever? And, you know, there is an answer around that in Christian theology, which is God felt estranged from humanity and humanity's suffering. And therefore, God chose to allow his only child to be killed so that God could feel the pain that humans feel. Did you ever hear that before? It's very much in the heart of Christianity, that the other purpose in Christ's death was so God could be more empathetic to the rest of us. So, you know, Christianity creates a different emotional structure, a different, we call it an immanent, directly accessible connection to God in a human form. And, you know, it's like the movie is like better than the book. Whereas Judaism is saying, no, we prefer the book. We're the people of the book. And we prefer to wrestle with the contradictions because we want to preserve the mystery around God.
So interesting to hear this.
See, I think that in Judaism, we use the word covenant a lot. And it's like a partnership. And what really, you know, what is the core of the Jewish covenant? And I think I experience it as creation is an unfinished phenomenon. Yes, God created, people say 7, you know, in 6 days. I tend to look at it as 6 eons. How long is a day for God? It's not 24 hours. In 6 eons, creation happened. And we as Jews believe in a creator that made that happen on purpose. But I think at the heart of Judaism is the idea that creation is not finished and God needs we humans were created to have a covenant, to be a partner with God. And we're supposed to continue the creation. We're supposed to continue the work of creation. And we know that Judaism teaches creation was an act of love, partly for God, an act of self-love, because God, Kabbalah suggests God was lonely and just didn't like there being just God and only God, no space, no room, no nothing else. So out of love for God's self, God created and then loved the creation. See, Christianity assumes that there was a breach in the relationship between God and humanity. And the way God chose to repair that breach was by presenting God in human form and then killing that as a form of redemption. In Judaism, we never believed that the relationship was broken. We still don't believe it. We do believe the relationship can be strained. The relationship can be strained, but it's never broken. And we still, even when it's strained, it depends on us. I mean, remember, again, now I'm just quoting Torah, but in the story of Noah and Noah's Ark at the end, you know, God says, I will never again destroy this world, basically saying, if it gets destroyed, it's on you. And that's another thing that Christianity, some forms of Christianity anyway, have also played upon the notion of, you know, the future of the world, the future of the universe. And while for us, if we destroy the world and don't repair it, that would be the biggest tragedy for God of all. Whereas in Christianity, if the world becomes dominated by despoliation, you know, and human degradation, some forms of Christianity celebrate that stuff. And that's called the rapture. And the world will get so horrible, God will decide, vavum, and then Christ will return, you know, to lead this new spiritual universe in God's image. But that image of God says that when the rapture happens, there'll be the people who can see the color cards and they'll be welcomed in, and the people who are colorblind who can't see the colored cards and they'll be excluded at the end of time. So you see, we have very different, not just concepts of God, not just concepts of history, but different concepts of human agency. And like I said, Judaism's not the easier package. It's not. And as a Jew, I'm grateful for that. I left you speechless. I don't know about that. Yeah,
I think it's fascinating.
please talk to me.
Amazing, really amazing. Wow.
Yeah, it's it.
And this is not to denigrate Christianity. I hope you do not hear anything I've said. And I would have this conversation. I've had this conversation with pastors, with priests, and we can talk, and you know, I can explain how I understand Christianity, and I may be corrected, which is fine. But part of what I'm sharing about Christianity is not just from years of study, but years of dialogue as well. And I'll tell you what's so fascinating, because I've had the wonderful fortune to have these conversations with enlightened Christians and priests who they're living inside their spiritual community with their adherents, and they share the package of Christianity in their way, depending on the denomination. And I have a particular friend in mind who's an Episcopal priest in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And Mariah and I mean, we've taught, for example, together, the controversial sections of Isaiah. We've done it together. And she shares the Christian interpretation of those sections, and I share the Jewish interpretation of those sections. And we do it respectfully. There's no animosity. And we just realize we are coming from completely different frames of reference. But what's really interesting is when I have these conversations with Christian colleagues at this level, sometimes I feel like they just pity me because I don't buy the Christian package, which for them is so obviously compelling. And some of them I think are a little apologetic at times, that they know they've been raised in a situation where consciously or unconsciously or both, they feel this need to Christianize the world and have everyone conform to their package. And I know many Christian priests, ministers, they believe what they believe, and they are not triumphalistic about Christianity. And they're willing to call it out and say, yes, this is mythic Christianity, and this notion that, the whole world has to become Christian, because of certain well-known sections of the New Testament. They're willing to bracket those sections out, just like we're willing to bracket out today the section about the blind and the disabled, etc.
But
And that's what gives me hope.
Oh. But you're also saying that it's not part of their theology that we are partners and that we need to repair the world. And if that is so, and there are so few Jews, so many more Christians, what does this mean for the world?
Well, it's a really good question. First of all, I don't want to make, again, just like in Christianity, there's the mystery of the church, is he 10% human and 90% divine, and that's not explained. There's also another dimension of Christianity where it's not all about faith. It's what they call works as well, faith and works. And there are streams of Christianity. It's not universally held, but there are streams of Christianity where doing good works in the world is still an obligation for some Christians. The question becomes, is doing those works just for the sake of doing good works, or is the doing of good works just a means to promote the message of Christianity at the same time? And the thing is, when it comes to the most dramatic difference between Judaism and Christianity is, we have this, we've developed this 20th century all-purpose term called tikkun olam, which actually derives from Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism and is in its origin not the way we use it today per se. We've generalized it, repair of the world. And why did Jews repair the world? Because that's what our covenant is about. It's what God wants us to do to improve life as best we can for everybody, starting with ourselves and with everybody. The thing is, in Christianity, sometimes you get the feeling that, I'm sorry. And when we do that tikkun olam, we're forbidden to try to convert anybody in the process. We're forbidden from proselytizing. We're forbidden from even questioning another person's faith. So there's a difference in the way we approach works and repair of the world and the way some Christians approach works, which is it's connected to their evangelism and to make the world Christian. And I will say this, and this is a political statement, and I'm going to say it because this is probably the only place I can say it. I feel very strongly that part of what's gone on in the United States, where we are at this moment in time, that I think is epitomized by what we think is the forthcoming decision about abortion in this country, is I think we as non-Christians in the United States have to recognize there has been an agenda to Christianize this country, to Christianize the government, even though we have no official religion, but de facto to dominate the political process, to advance the notion of a white Christian nation. And I think people who don't want to like look at that have their head in the sand. And I'm not trying to attack Christians, but I think we should also call a spade that, you know, in a country that I believe we have separation of church and state, certainly no official religion, doesn't mean there's a separation of religion and society, but there has been, and it goes, by the way, it goes back to 1973. 1973, a group of evangelical leaders in this country got together and they proposed something called Key 73. It was a movement, it was an idea. It was an idea that was first adopted by the televangelists. If you remember just how influential and powerful they were in the 70s and 80s, and that there's been an agenda by, you know, a group, I call them Christian oligarchs, trying to dominate and take over the politics of the United States. And it's happened little by little by little by little by little. And for us in the Jewish community, it should feel threatening. For us in the Jewish community who don't proselytize, it should feel threatening. And for us in the Jewish community who are, really spiritually speaking, inclusive of all other faiths, as long as they're not out to hurt us, that should concern us as a Jewish community. Because, the only thing that some of these politicians are not doing, but their forebears did back in the 70s and 80s, the only thing they're not doing, and believe me, they're going to start doing it soon, is they're going to hold up a Bible and say, this really is the Constitution of the United States. And be prepared. Be prepared. I don't want to end on a down note, but I think we have to be realistic. And the thing is not to go to war with Christians and Christianity, but it's to, keep hammering away at the protection of civil liberties in this country, and to hammer away at, protection of people's privacy, what they believe in their minds, the control over their own bodies, and, people's ability to maintain their autonomy from a system that may be trying to impose upon them. And I'll give you a perfect example. Look, I lived in Arkansas 5 years, right? And my first article I wrote for the local newspaper, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, was titled, "Being a Rabbi in the Buckle of the Bible Belt." And in the article, I talked about some of these issues, and I made a friend, someone who read the article I met, who's a very staunch evangelical Christian, and his wife is even more so. She's like, in a sense, the epitome of this kind of an individual, American individual, who believes in their heart of hearts, the only way America can be saved is through the love of Christ, and will stop at nothing to promote that idea. And will look at me square in the eye. Jody will look at me square in the eye and say, "Rob, we love you so much. We just don't want you to be left behind. We want you. We love you. We want you to know the love of Christ. And even if you don't, we still love you, and I'll wave goodbye when the time comes." And this is said with like a straight face, like no observing ego to think that could be offensive to me or threatening to me, or no awareness of it. And they're so faith intoxicated. And that's the risk of faith intoxication, is extremism. And that's the whole point of Judaism, is it's not, faith is there, but we don't make it all about faith. We make it much, why do we have one statement of faith, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We have 613 mitzvahs of deeds we're supposed to do. Any parting thoughts? Got a couple more minutes.
So what's the next, after they get rid of abortion, what's the next thing they'll go after? Will it be interracial marriage? Will it be homosexuality and I mean, what do you think is the next big thing on their agenda?
I actually think it'll be birth control. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see measures like that in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, in that southern tier potentially. And I think that I just can't imagine the Supreme Court. I couldn't imagine them turning back Roe v. Wade, but I can't imagine them turning back marriage equality. I can't imagine it, but it's hard to say. There are some members of the court right now and the new people that came on under Trump. And, I think they outright lied during those hearings. And I think they, did a good job of hiding how their Christianity actually is driving their opinions, because they could never admit it in public. But it seems fairly obvious at this point. And I think we just have to be vigilant.
Shalom.
And Judaism, whether right or wrong, we have a completely different view of how to define a human being. And we honestly do believe that until a person is born, they're not a human being. They're not breathing on their own. They're not independent in any way. They are completely dependent on the mother, and the mother owns that. And yet we don't believe in frivolous abortion or abortion for convenience. We do not. We don't support it. But there are all kinds of reasons where it is appropriate, and that at the end of the day, it's still a woman's right to decide for herself. It's her property.
I appreciate your views and I understand many of them, but I also find it very scary with the people on the left who are extreme, like the people who follow AOC and people like that. And so I find both extremes on the extreme right and the extreme left to be very scary.
I agree with you. And I don't know a lot of people on the left, extreme left, associated with extreme Christianity, but they're there. And I agree with you. The extreme left seems to be behaving in its own disruptive way. And
yes, I'm talking about Antifa and the people who burn down people's businesses. And those people are just as scary as the maybe Christians that you're talking about. So both sides of extreme are very scary.
Yes, by the way, my political statement wasn't really about right or left. It was, I did not intend it that way. I agree with you. Extremism on both sides is destructive. I completely agree with you. What I did want to point out, though, theologically speaking, there's a theological construct that drives Christian extremism in whatever form it gets expressed. And it happens to show up politically on the right, and through the over 35, 40 years, that corpus of the Christian community has fought to take over school committees and boards of selectmen and city councils and control the congressional mapping and, trying to, play the system to bring about their ultimate goals. And there are people on the left doing the same thing, and they have their own set of goals too, which I don't necessarily agree with either. Personally, I tend to be a centrist, and I've always have been. And I was raised as a Democrat, but not an extremist by any means. And my mother told me that the core expression of being a Jew is fighting for being a social activist and advancing the rights of others. She never went.
Just hope that women still have the right to choose. When I was on the nursing staff at an OBGYN practice, I was the only one who would help the doctors to do the pregnancy terminations, because every other nurse was Catholic.
Wow.
And I was the only one who would have to go from doctor to doctor to assist the doctors, because
Wow.
no one would do it.
Wow.
I would hope that they would find a different method of birth control. But when the 16-year-olds would come in, for pregnancy terminations year after year, I was the only one who would help because, being Jewish, I believed in choice, and no one else did because all the other nurses were Catholic.
Wow.
Personally, if a Catholic has their position that they hold about abortion, I respect that. That's an individual's choice. It's the problem when people feel they have to impose their personal choice on others.
Yeah.
And I do believe, if you read the writings of Jefferson very closely, that this country was really intended to be founded on a social idea that protected individual privacy and recognized the autonomous thought of every individual person, and that government had no role in imposing upon that. And I do think the country was founded that way, as imperfect as the Declaration is, as imperfect as the original form of the Constitution is. They're human documents and they're imperfect, but people start using those documents to try to impose they call it their political will. And when their political will is an extension of their theological drama, that was exactly why we left England, was not only the imposition of taxes, but the people didn't want to be bound by the Anglican Church either. They wanted to have more freedom and diversity, even within Christianity. And don't forget, the Puritans came here and they were pretty extremist when they got here. But they said, at least we're doing our own thing, freedom to be ourselves. So let me just say before we close that, I think as Jews, it is way more a blessing than a curse that we are given an imperfect system, an imperfect Torah, and that the greatest, in a way, spiritual activity for Jews is not to come up with the answers to these questions, but to wrestle through what the questions provoke in our thought, in our insight, in our wisdom. And the only thing I'm going to end with is that, for all the marginalization mentioned in today's Torah portion, there's a line in Pirkei Avot, which to me is this pithy, perfect line that goes to the heart of what we do here whenever we have Torah study, and what I think Judaism is really very much about, among so many other things. And where in Pirkei Avot, the question is asked, who is wise? And the answer is the one who learns from all people. Underline the word all. And so that notion, that imperfect notion, none of us has all the information. None of us has the package down pat. We can all learn from each other. That's, to me, such a beautiful part of being Jewish. And that's why, because we know we don't have the perfect answers, unlike others, to use a line from or terminology from Jefferson, we have no compulsion when it comes to religious faith. No compulsion to change anybody. No compulsion to, like, get inside people's heads and convince them they're evil, impure, and unacceptable. And we have the answer to that.
Yeah.
There's a certain security in that. There's an intellectual maturity in that. No compulsion with regard to religion or faith. And that's something we should be proud of.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for learning together.
Thank you.
Tikkun olam.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
We'll have, we're
Thank
gonna
you,
do
Rabbi.
Friday, we're gonna do Friday next week. Right?
Yes.
Yes,
Look
yeah,
forward.
the
Friday at
20th.
Friday at 7.
Okay, great.
See you then.
Hey, thank
Thanks,
you.
Rabbi. Thanks, everybody.